All right, Deuteronomy 21, let's call this one mysteries, marriages, and curses. Three things that don't necessarily sound like they have a lot to do with one another, but hopefully it'll tie together by the time we get to the end of the chapter. First of all, mysteries. Mysteries has to do with the fact that this is dealing with cases of unsolved murders. Anytime there is a body found, I think it's in the countryside, they're going to measure the distance to the nearest city and have that city deal with the issue by having the elders once again take a heifer. This time not a red heifer, but they're going to break the heifer's neck, and then they're going to wash their hands over the heifer. And in many ways it sounds like the whole concept of washing their hands of the matter, but their washing their hands of the matter is not simply abdicating responsibility. It's taking responsibility for the fact that they neither had anything to do with the unsolved murder nor were witness to the unsolved murder. And so it begged the question for me, well, if they're just the nearest city, what if people in the other town really knew about it? Well, that's taken care of in another part of the law where, if you remember back, we talked about anybody who is a witness to a crime has a responsibility to step up. And so the nation is under the obligation to step up if you have seen anything, but the nearest town in this provision is required to step up and atone for the blood guilt on behalf of the nation. Moving on from that, the marriages is really going to break down into three categories, because when the men go off to war in the nations that they do not have to completely rid the land of, they can take the women who are surviving as wives if they so choose. But if they're going to take a woman as a wife, they can't then treat her as a slave. You always have to remember the greater principle of the law, as Jesus summed it up, is love God and love people. And so even in situations where we're going to look at in the next two chapters, where the Bible is not establishing gender equality, there's really no two ways around that. It is still functioning under a fundamental principle of love, and respect is a part of love. So if a man is going to take a captive as a wife, he has to give her a mourning period, and that mourning period is at least a month. After that month, he can take her as a wife. But if he takes her as a wife and realizes he doesn't like her, there's a divorce provision. But he can't then sell her as a slave, understanding that a captured nation could be taken into servitude. She now has a right as a free woman. Ultimately, that carries over into the next principle, which is the principle of a man who has multiple wives. If he has two wives, at least, and one is loved and one is not loved, similar to what we saw in Leah and Rachel and being married to Jacob, he cannot switch the birth order based upon his preference. Meaning, if he's got a firstborn son of an unloved woman, he can't simply make the firstborn a matter of choice, meaning he can't simply show preferential treatment to a younger child of a preferred wife. Going on from that, there is a provision about an unruly son that in some ways ties all of these three together using a concept we talked about with the rules of war, and that's decorum, meaning no matter how harsh the situation, decorum is always the order. And so in a situation where parents have tried to discipline a child, but he just won't listen, rebellion is something that is to be rooted out of the society at its very foundation, whether it's a child, a husband of a wife, who is Israeli, or a husband of a wife who is a foreigner. There's only so far you can go in disrespecting the rights of other people in Israeli society under God's law. And that's what these principles of marriage have to do with. There are limitations on what a man can do simply of his own free will without regard to the respect of the people involved in his family. And then finally, the curse comes in a very famous passage quoted in the New Testament. Jesus became a curse for us. And the last passage here talks about the one who is hanged on a tree is cursed, and the body is not to be left overnight. So even in a situation where a person is executed, you don't desecrate the body, because desecrating a dead body, even of a criminal, can bring consequences on the land. Because once again, decorum, or proper behavior, or human decency, is once again a principle of love that seems to be woven throughout the law, even when you're dealing with a criminal who's suffering the penalty for their crime. And so the tie that seems to bind all these passages together seems to be the decorum that's necessary in resolving or taking responsibility for an unsolved murder, the decorum that's required of a husband in leading a household, or a child who is living under the roof of his parents, and the decorum that's required even of an executioner executing the sentence against the convicted or condemned people. And so in that, even when the laws in Israel seem harsh or maybe archaic to us, the underlying principle is, as Jesus said, it's always love. And in this case, the love that is shown, the respect that God's people are to show toward one another.